Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, November 5th. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for everything you do for the Washington Brief. Today is Election Day. We have a very special program entitled "The New President Will Face North Korea and Regional Conflicts Threatening to Become Global." Kim Jong-un is talking about an unthinkable first strike on the South, and he's been destroying the bridges and connections between the North and the South. And just recently, North Korean troops were sent to join Russia, and we're going to be talking about that today. Really honored to present to you our regular panelist, Dr. Alexandre Mansourov. Dr. Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also is an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. Our guest speaker today is very well known throughout the world. The Honorable Speaker Newt Gingrich served in the U.S. House of Representatives for over 20 years, from 78 to 99, and was a Speaker of the House from 1995 to 1999. He was well known as the architect for the contract with America that led the Republican Party to victory in 1994. And it created the first conservative majority in the House of Representatives in 40 years. He was a Republican candidate for president in 2012, contributor and also a columnist for the Washington Times. His podcast is called Newt's World, and syndicated columnist with over 41 books, including 18 fiction and nonfiction New York Times bestsellers, including the current bestseller, March to the Majority, which I've read. It's excellent. Speaker Gingrich and his wife, Ambassador Callista L. Gingrich, host and produce historical and public policy documentaries. Recent films include The First American and Divine Mercy, the canonization of John Paul II. Gingrich 360 is a multimedia production and consulting company based in Arlington, Virginia. Speaker Gingrich is recognized internationally as an expert on world history, military issues, and international affairs. Speaker Gingrich also teaches the Joint War Fighting Course for Major Generals. He also teaches officers from all 6 services as a distinguished visiting scholar and professor at the National Defense University. We welcome Speaker Gingrich for this program. Our moderator today is a well-known expert on the Northeast Asia and around the world for intelligence. Ambassador Joseph DeTrani is a commentator on security issues. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani served as special envoy for the 6-party talks with North Korea, and he was the director of National Counterproliferation Center, as well as Associate Director of National Intelligence. Ambassador DeTrani, we look forward to the program today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. This should be just an outstanding session today with Speaker Gingrich. In the United States, our election day, a new administration is coming in, a new administration that's going to be looking at what's happening in North Korea with the 8,000 troops that they have in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation, with a lot of rhetoric coming out, but indeed including what we just saw a few days ago, an intercontinental ballistic missile launch that was unprecedented. It flew over 4,300 miles. That was the altitude, thus capable of reaching the whole of the United States. This is just the beginning of what North Korea with Kim Jong-un has been doing over the last year and a half, since this very close alliance with the Russian Federation. But obviously the war in Ukraine continues with significant casualties on both sides. But indeed, Israel facing not only Hamas in Gaza, but facing Hezbollah in Lebanon, facing the Houthis in Yemen, dealing with Iran and that element there. So there's so much to unpack, and we're so fortunate to have Speaker Gingrich with us today to unpack all these very difficult issues and indeed look to the new administration, the US administration, and how likely this new administration would handle these issues and some of the others. Over to you, Speaker Gingrich.
Well, let me say, first of all, that the policy of weakness, which has been followed by the Biden-Harris administration, has emboldened dictatorships and autocrats everywhere on the planet. And I think it's very sobering that the Russian-Korean relationship has grown as strongly as it has. It's very sobering that the North Koreans are now apparently sending 10,000 or more troops to Ukraine on the side of Russia. And it's very sobering that apparently the Russians in return are sending scientists and technicians to increase the capacity of the North Korean missile system. I think that where President Trump had begun to forge a relationship with Kim Jong-un and given him an incentive to not be this aggressive, that the more passive approach that we've had under Biden has actually frustrated Kim Jong-un and led him to believe that he has a relatively low risk of losing anything, and therefore he can increase his preparations. I find it, and of course, you know far more than I do about this, Ambassador, but I find it very sobering that he is apparently destroying bridges, cutting off roads, almost preparing for an assault on Seoul and trying to make it to harden the border. So it'll be very hard for the Republic of Korea to respond effectively. I personally believe that South Korea has to look at the Israeli experience with the Iron Dome. They have to prepare a very substantial investment in missile defense systems and recognize that this is a very real possibility. You're dealing with a dictatorship which could decide to take enormous risks for reasons we don't fully understand, because the truth is we don't understand the dictatorship. We're not quite sure what motivates not just Kim Jong-un, but his sister, who is the most likely successor, and the military elites that have, invested 3 generations in developing a nuclear and missile capability. So they have a huge investment. They've suffered a great deal of economic privation to acquire these capabilities. And I think that they are a relatively isolated, paranoid nation with no real sense of relating to the rest of the world, except to the degree that they want to survive and that they believe literally that they're in constant danger of extinction. So I think it's very dangerous. I personally think they're the second most dangerous country in the world after Iran. The difference being that the Iranians actually have a religiously motivated desire to destroy both the United States and Israel, and say so publicly. I mean, when they say death to America, the Ayatollah Khomeini about 3 months ago actually went on national television to reassure people that, in his words, this is not a slogan, this is a policy. Well, we don't have anything like that level of aggressiveness out of Kim Jong-un, but we do have a consistent steady build on. And I think an awareness the North and South are separated, and the longer the South is able to keep growing, the bigger the gap is in wealth and in opportunity, in sophistication. And I think at one level, the North Koreans almost feel like they're going to run out of time and at some point just be dwarfed by their neighbors. Remember, and you know this better than I do, but I think as late as about 1979, South Korea's income per person was slightly below North Korea. And the economic growth since then has been so breathtaking that there's just no comparison in the two countries. And there's no potential within the dictatorship of North Korea catching up economically. So all of these, I think, make the region more dangerous, compounded, and we can get into this later if you want to, compounded by developments in China, communist China, Taiwan, and Japan.
Wow, this is a Speaker Gingrich. You mentioned what North Korea is doing in regards to their taking down the roads, the rail links to the south, seemingly preparing to have conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We saw this in 1950, and then with an armistice in 1953, and the significant casualties we all suffered. So hopefully this does not repeat itself, but we have to be very, very, and I think we are. And you spoke, Speaker Gingrich, about President Trump, how he reached out to Kim Jong-un. And so maybe we can get into a discussion of that. What's the likelihood of, if indeed President Trump is reelected, what's the likelihood that he would reach out to Kim Jong-un? And what's the likelihood that Kim Jong-un would be responsive? But before we unpack some of these things, I'd like to go to Professor Mansourov for your comments, Professor, and some questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And greetings, Mr. Speaker. What an amazing presentation portraying those difficult, very complex challenges which the new administration in Washington is likely to deal with. Now, before I ask my question, let me highlight a couple of latest the security situation on the peninsula and share with you some of my analysis of that. And the first big news, of course, is the ratification by the lower house of the Russian parliament of the comprehensive strategic partnership treaty with North Korea. I mean, the complete process of ratification is not finished yet. It has to go to the upper house and then to President Putin for his signature. But the first important step has been accomplished. This treaty has been partially ratified. Number one. Number two, of course, the North Korean foreign minister is visiting Moscow now. She just met with her Russian counterpart, and she said in that meeting that North Korea will stand by her Russian allies, shoulder to shoulder, until Russian victory on the battlefield in that war with Ukraine, no matter what the human price, no matter what the cost. So clear statement. Basically, she said, Kim Jong-un told us, disregard the costs. I mean, we'll fight side by side until victory. And of course, this is all happening against the background of what Ambassador DeTrani portrayed as unprecedented test of the newest intercontinental ballistic missile, Hwasong-19, which flew further than anything, any missile system which they tested in the past. Now, it would not have been all that kind of ominous if the Russian foreign minister, in his conversation with Choi Son-hee, didn't say that, and I quote here, denuclearization of North Korea is dead. That's what Lavrov said. Why? Because of the nuclearization of the US-ROC alliance. So basically, he put the blame on the efforts by the United States and South Korea to transform our alliance into a more robust military partnership with a nuclear dimension. Also, he said in that meeting today that to deter the South Korean-US alliance, Russia actually may extend its nuclear umbrella over to North Korea. Not that North Korea needs it, but in a way he was talking about a nuclear security guarantee to North Korea, which is a reversal of long-standing Russian nuclear deterrence doctrine, in some sense, lowering a little bit the kind of nuclear threshold from the Moscow standpoint. And finally, in that same meeting, he kind of signaled that if the United States were to transfer any type of nuclear capability to Ukraine, then Russia may consider leaving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty North North Korea into the nuclear non-proliferation regime seems to be kind of falling on deaf ears in Moscow here. Now, and this is just the nuclear aspect of that rapidly growing military-to-military cooperation and strategic partnership between Russia and North Korea, which you alluded to, which you said was very ominous and dangerous. And of course, some people wonder, I mean, Kim Jong-un, what does he stand to gain from the latest development on the conventional side, and that is the troop deployment, which Ambassador DeTrani alluded to, more than 8,000 Russian troops deployed to the Kursk region in the Russian Federation. And you, Mr. Speaker, said that it's hard to understand North Koreans and their logic and their thinking. And let me enumerate at least 6 good reasons why Kim Jong-un may be doing it, despite all the criticisms, all the concerns, etc. And number 1 is, believe it or not, its international reputation. North Korea, after deploying this limited military contingent to Russia to support it in its war in Ukraine, is coming out, it's regarded now as a strong military power that can change the course of war as far away as Europe. Again, they're not saying it, but our media is saying it. I mean, we are lionizing North Korea, and we're making them to appear much bigger, much more powerful than they are. Now, for Kim Jong-un personally, I mean, he comes across as a reliable ally to be sought after, especially, after his foreign minister says that we'll stand by you as a show of allied solidarity, no matter what, until your victory. That's number 1. Number 2, diplomatic support. Russia broke ranks with the international community and began to dismantle international sanctions. And basically, now North Korea's international isolation is crumbling because we have a big, hole in the sanctions regime, and that is Russia. Also, it helps North Korea to distance a little bit from China, get a little bit more independence from China, reduce a little bit its over-reliance, kind of lopsided reliance on the Chinese for everything. So diplomatic support, number 2. Number 3, I would highlight learning. Learning is important through real-life combat training in real war. I mean, think about the KPA, Korean People's Army. They really haven't had any real combat experience since the Korean War. I mean, except a few incidents across the border, but real no participation in major wars around the world for the past 7 decades. I mean, you cannot count trash balloon flying as real combat experience. And so now they're going to get that real combat experience in real war, where they can basically learn, modern military tactics, modern military operational art from the best armies in the world, Ukrainian, Russian army, and all the NATO allies. And you can discount, okay, it's just 3 brigades, 1 division, but they scale it up. They can scale it up and basically use the experience learned by those 10,000 soldiers to train 100,000, 200,000 more North Korean troops back at home. And by the way, I expect that they will rotate those troops. And so instead of 10,000, maybe up to 100, maybe 200,000 North Korean troops will go through that mid-grinder in Ukraine. Also, they have a chance to evaluate the performance of their armaments basically in real combat and improve. That's number 3. Number 4, it's the transfer. You alluded to the transfer of critical Russian advanced military technologies, nuclear missile expertise technologies. Hwasong 19, we just saw that very successful launch. And this is just the beginning. More importantly, they need satellite navigation. They need precision targeting. That's what for that kind of knowledge and expertise to the North Koreans. Number 5, it's financial gain. Don't ignore financial gain. North Korea, for all its supplies of ammunition, armaments to Russia, has already reportedly earned over $5 billion from Russia. $5 billion. It's more than they ever dreamed to learn from all the missile sales around the world, all the conventional arms sales around the world. Now, reportedly, the Russian annual payment for the deployment of limited military contingent to Russia will amount to about $572 million a year. So when you think about it, it's, you know, the North Korean GNP, 28 billion. They earned almost 6 billion, a quarter of their GDP through that engagement. That's a very handsome financial gain at the time when they're isolated economically. And finally, you know, and plus, of course, Russian economic assistance, all the oil and grain, which is going to be shipped to North Korea. But the final and really intangible gain will be the accrued Russian moral debt of gratitude, if you wish. When everybody is turning away, even Lukashenko refuses to say that you know, he'll dispatch troops to Russia. North Korea is the only ally which decided to stand by Russia and fight until the end, until victory. So guess what? Should a contingency arise on the Korean Peninsula, any Russian leadership, you know, of the current kind of brand will be under tremendous moral pressure to commit Russian troops, let alone, you know, other types of military assistance, to defend North Korea in its fight against the US-ROK alliance. So that's why, from Kim Jong-un's standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to commit and send a limited military contingent to the theater. Now, what is, I'll spend one more minute to highlight the question. But the significance, really, of this North Korean deployment, in my opinion, is threefold. Number one, really, it will make no difference at all, on the course of war in Ukraine. And you know why? Because there are 700,000 troops on the Russian side, more or less the same number on the Ukrainian side, 2,000-mile long line of contact. So nothing really can be done by those 8,000 or 10,000 North Korean special operation forces, mostly deployed in the Russian-controlled Kursk area in the rear. But obviously, it will help North Korea, Ukrainian propaganda to mobilize additional Western support for its war effort. Now, I believe the most important significance of this deployment is that it will enable North Korean army to learn, train, and improve to become a much more lethal and formidable force to face the US-ROK alliance. A couple of other points. It will help Russia backfill its positions, military positions around the world with North Korean troops when now Russians have to retreat, places like Mali, Chad, Syria. And North Koreans has that track record. You know, remember back in the 1960s, 70s, when they, you know, were fighting on the Soviet side and all these regional conflicts around the world together with the Cubans. Now, my question really, and I'll stop here just asking the question along the lines of Ambassador DeTrani kind of thought about normalization of North Korean-US relationship. I mean, the fact that Kim Jong-un committed so much of his reputation, of his resources to this new partnership, strategic partnership, really military alliance under Article 4 with Russia, does it mean that, you know, all hopes for normalization of relations with the United States are gone? Or, in your opinion, is there still a chance that if President Trump is reelected, then normalization might still be possible? I mean, we know if Kamala Harris wins, then it will be more of the same kind of Biden's policy on North Korea. But with President Trump, given his track record on North Korea, given his experience of engaging Kim Jong-un in summit-level diplomacy, the agreements they made in Singapore especially, I mean, do you think there is to kind of find a way for normalizing our relations? Or is it a kind of dead hope at this point?
Speaker Gingrich.
Well, let me say, first of all, that's a brilliant outline. I loved the way you organized it and thought it was very impressive. I'd say a couple of things. Part of what struck me, particularly when you're talking about the Russian potential to extend a nuclear umbrella over the Korean Peninsula, is that the analogy people tend to use about the current situation is the 1930s and the rise of Hitler and Japan and Italy as aggressive competitors to the existing order. That may be the wrong analogy. The more dangerous analogy may be 1900 to 1914, as these alliances became more and more intertwined until you end up with a Serbian nationalist killing the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, leading to a German guarantee, which draws the Russians in, and suddenly you have World War I. The point that hit me as you were describing it, that you start getting North Koreans in Ukraine, you start getting a Russian nuclear umbrella over North Korea. People are beginning to give away IOUs, and that's what happened before World War I, where the Germans felt that they had to honor their commitment to Austria. Austria felt that they had to crush the Serbians at a point where one of the Serbian nationalists had killed the Archduke, who was going to be the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Russians felt they had to step in on behalf of the Slavic people in the Balkans. The French felt they had to honor their relationship to Russia. The British felt that they could not tolerate a German domination of the continent. All of a sudden, what in July and August was a relatively simple diplomatic problem, by all of the different pieces coming together, became by a world war. Well, I think you have a real danger here, week by week, that we're seeing more and more of these relationships in a way that a cascading effect that nobody expects and nobody counts on. Second, I think you touched on something really important that may be, and I say this recognizing after having looked at North Korea for a long time. My dad fought in Korea in '53, so my family's had a long interest in the peninsula. I think that you may have really touched on something important in that I don't think the North Koreans were comfortable having only China as a supporter, because I think they deeply distrust Xi Jinping. And again, there's a long Korean history of trying to be independent from both Japan and China. So in a way, Moscow is a very long way from North Korea. And so I think that it's very possible that they are delighted to have a relationship which on the northeastern side of the country allows materials from Vladivostok to come down and to provide them an outlet without being totally controlled by the Chinese. And you may have put your finger on something that was a part of the calculus I hadn't thought about. I think your notion that this is a good training ground is exactly right, and reminded me of the role that the Spanish Civil War played in the 30s, where the Germans and the Italians and the Soviets were all in there learning about modern warfare by doing it. And I think you're right, because my hunch is that the North Korean army has been so obsolete and so undertrained that it's actually not a very good army right now. They have nuclear weapons, which makes them a very dangerous country, but they probably in a conventional fight would not last very long against either the Republic of Korea, and certainly not against the combined forces of the Republic of Korea and the United States. So I think in that sense, you may have put your finger on part of it, which is he will, over the next year or two, acquire a group of people who've been involved in modern combat and who've learned a great deal more about the speed and complexity of modern warfare. At the same time, what Putin is trying to do, I think, is minimize pressure on the Russian population. I have a good friend, Herman Perchner at the American Foreign Policy Council, who has been, I think, to Russia like 110 times or something, and has a huge range of contacts. And he believes that the level of unrest in the Russian elites is very real, that they think they've been sucked into a fight they didn't need, that it's been much more expensive than they thought it would be, both expensive in human lives and expensive in money, and that I think Putin in part is trying to look for positive things to show his own allies inside the Russian government that there is hope that something will break in a good way. I think all that comes together. My greatest worry is, and of course you both know this much better than I do, but every time Calista and I have gone to Seoul and then driven north to the boundary, and you realize you're talking 30, 40 miles. I mean, the ability of the North Koreans just using conventional artillery to pummel Seoul, Korea, which is one of the largest metropolises in the world. And I think this is potentially one of the most dangerous places in the world. And I don't think that we either spend enough time thinking about how to defend it or spend enough time thinking about we create some kind of incentive plan that will convince Kim Jong-un that he doesn't want to have a war. And part of that is, frankly, that if he did start a war, it would be the end of the regime. I think that we would, and we have to communicate that to him, that it would not be limited, because you can't have Seoul, as vulnerable as it is, have them think that they can hit Seoul and then somehow negotiate, sort of a ceasefire with the status quo ante. I mean, you've got to convince them that to ever cross that line is to be the end of the dictatorship. And if they believe that, I suspect they won't do anything. But if they think they can somehow humble South Korea, because again, their model is we have enormous military strength in a dictatorship. You have enormous, so our military can offset your prosperity. And I think they believe that. I mean, that's part of what scares me about the regime.
Speaker Gingrich, such excellent points from some very, very good analysis and questions from Professor Mansourov. Let me posit something, if I may. Having worked in the six-party talks and negotiated with the North Koreans for about 13 years, let me tell you that, and I think we know this, their interest is a normal relationship with the United States. This is something they've been pursuing Kim Il-sung in 1994 with the agreed framework, obviously Kim Jong-il with the six-party talks, and Kim Jong-un with the Singapore, if you will, declaration with President Donald Trump. It fell apart with Hanoi. That's unfortunate, but it did fall apart. And Kim Jong-un lost some face, or quite a bit of face, with that. But over the last almost 4 years, we've sort of neglected North Korea. We sort of said, given everything else, maybe there's a question of bandwidth. We just can't handle everything. North Korea is not important. And put it aside. This doesn't work with North Korea. Ignoring North Korea is not an option. Kim Jong-un and certainly his father, Kim Jong-il, and grandfather, Kim Il-sung, made it very clear with their behavior. But their relationship is with the United States. And what's so tragic, in my view, is watching them now align themselves so closely with the Russian Federation, sending troops to Kursk, we're talking about 8,000, 10,000 troops. Professor Mansourov was talking about significant numbers that could escalate and the war experience they get. But I think, Speaker Gingrich, you put your finger right on it. North Korea knows if they incite something, if they attack our allies in South Korea, Japan, we're there, and it will be the end of the regime. And that regime probably is very fragile. Because and you said that, Speaker Gingrich, this is opaque. We don't know what's going on. We don't know the pressure on Kim Jong-un to build more nuclear weapons, to be in the face of the United States, to align with the Russian Federation, and to move in a lot of ways. So what I'm thinking is, and my question to you would be, Former President Donald Trump had a good relationship with Kim Jong-un. I think there are indications here. I mean, Professor Mansourov mentioned Chae Soon-hee, the foreign minister. Well, I've dealt with Chae Soon-hee for many, many years. She knows the United States very well. And this is where North Korea has always been, to come into the family of nations. And the economic advantages would be many, but they wanted a path for normalization of relations with the United States. And we said it's got to be complete, verifiable denuclearization. And that's been the hiccup, complete, verifiable denuclearization. Because they concealed that program. It's a secret program. And now it's not secret. Kim Jong-un put it right out to the world, saying, not only do we have these ballistic missiles, and the Hwasong-19 just launched a few days ago, but we're making more nuclear weapons, and we're making them through plutonium. We're doing it with highly enriched uranium. So the United States accepts us as a nuclear weapon state and will behave properly. And we won't even build more nuclear weapons. But our nuclear weapons are for deterrence purposes. This has been the North Korean line for the last 30 years. We will be a very responsible, and you did it with Pakistan. Why can't you do it with us? So I think there's a lot of consternation in South Korea and other places that the US is moving towards an maybe arms control agreement with North Korea. If we can get into negotiations about arms control and so forth. I think many of us, and I'm one of them, believe it's got to be complete, verifiable denuclearization, because the element of proliferation, nuclear proliferation, is there. And we saw it with Syria, where the North Koreans were building a nuclear reactor in Syria, in violation of all agreements prior to that. And we see it with Al Qaeda and others, these terrorist organizations saying they would want access to a nuclear weapon or fissile material for dirty bombs. So all these pieces are coming together. But I think the imperative here is, and this is my question to you, Speaker Gingrich, the imperative here is don't continue to ignore North Korea. Now they're in our face. They're telling us very clearly, what's the likelihood that President Donald Trump, if reelected, will reach out to Kim Jong-un? And what's the likelihood that Kim Jong-un, in your view, would be responsive to this outreach by President Donald Trump?
Well, let me first ask, because I want to clarify something. Were you saying that the bottom line has to be verifiable non-proliferation or verifiable denuclearization?
Verifiable, complete verifiable denuclearization.
Well, I mean, my uninformed hunch is that that's not achievable. That I can't imagine why they would, given what happened to Gaddafi when he gave up his chemical weapons program, and shortly after that got killed. I'm not quite sure how they say to themselves, we're going to give up 3 generations of sacrifice because we trust the Americans and the South Koreans. I think you could probably get a pretty good non-proliferation agreement to not export the capability. But my personal, I'm not an expert, obviously, but my personal hunch is it'll be very, very hard, if not impossible, to get them to denuclearize. And part of that's because I try to always remind people, it doesn't matter whether or not there are American nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. We are 28 minutes from Minot, South Dakota to Pyongyang with an ICBM, and we're about 15 minutes with a Trident. So we always have nuclear capability. Trump told me an amazing story that when he met with Obama during the transition, Obama said to him, the greatest single worry Obama had was North Korea. He then discovered that Kim Jong-un, on 16 different occasions, had tried to call Obama, and Obama had refused to take the call. Now, Trump wrote 2 brilliant books, The Art of the Deal and The Art of the Comeback, and is a master negotiator. And this is something he cannot get across to the American press corps. You can't negotiate if you're not in the room. And so his instinct, whether it's with Putin or whether it's with Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un, his instinct is, let's sit down and have coffee and chat and get to know each other, and then we'll see whether or not there's a deal. But if you're not in the room and you're not talking, you'll never find a way to get to a deal. And I have a hunch that if he does become president again, that he will immediately reopen both with Putin and with Kim Jong-un a dialogue for different purposes, obviously. But in both cases, he will be seeking to move towards a normalization and kind of a pacification. I mean, I think Trump, in his first term, and I watched this happen in chatting with him, at some point he got a briefing on the consequences of a genuine world war. Campaign trail talking about World War III and that we have to avoid it. He really means it. I mean, he has figured out that nuclear weapons are a nightmare of incalculable horror, and that avoiding their use, and Eisenhower felt this way. Eisenhower said one time that if there was a nuclear war, he didn't want to be one of the survivors because it would be too horrifying to try to live through. And so I think in that sense that Trump will be very careful with countries that have nuclear weapons and will be actively trying to find ways to diffuse the relationship so that we sort of step further and further back from the abyss of deciding we have to try to wipe each other out. That's just my instinct. And that he will do it very much the way he describes in his 2 books on negotiating. And, it'll be a dance. I mean, he'll go back and forth. He'll be tough sometimes, happy sometimes. He'll do what he thinks will expand the communications with the people he's trying to understand and trying to get to agree to a deal.
So why do you think, Speaker Gingrich, that President Obama refused to take one of those 17 calls? And why do you think we've sort of, at least from the North Korean optic, we've sort of ignored North Korea for the last 4 years? Why do you think we've taken a policy line along those, if you will, along that course?
Well, I always tell people that if you really want to understand liberalism and national security in its modern form, you have to understand that they saw The Lion King and thought it was a documentary. And they think that lions and zebras sing and dance together. And when you try to explain to them that in the real world, lions actually eat zebras, they explain to you, no, don't you remember that movie? So you have a person like Obama who has a self-righteous moral imperative. And he is morally too superior in his own mind to deal with Kim Jong-un. I mean, it is an utterly irrational, out of touch with the real world model. You have in Joe Biden, somebody who, former Secretary of Defense and head of the Central Intelligence Agency, Bob Gates once said, in 50 years of his career, Biden has been wrong on every major national security issue. So why would you think he's going to get any better once he's president? And the modern left believes in a kind of weird morality, which you see, for example, with Hamas and Israel. Hamas, massacres over 1,200 people, including babies, rapes women, holds hostages. And within days, the first response on the left is, we have to be really careful in Gaza not to hurt innocent people. As opposed to, you really have to go kill all the terrorists, which is the only rational strategy in that setting. So I think they have a sense of purity. They also, and I'd be curious to get your reaction to this. Part of what's hit me is that we had a sanctions strategy when we were the dominant economy on the planet by a huge margin. And as long as we had the Europeans with us, our total joint economic power was so great that a sanctions strategy made some sense. It certainly helped cripple the Soviet Union and helped bring about its demise. We're the biggest country in the world economically, but there are too many potential buyers. You see this with the Iranians and oil. I mean, there are people going to buy Iranian oil no matter what the U.S. government says. I think in that sense, a sanctions regime, if the North Koreans have both Chinese and Russian support, and I think it's very significant, as you pointed out earlier, if they can add Russia to their supply list in a serious way, as well as keeping China, I think it's virtually impossible for sanctions to cripple them. It can slow them down, it can make some things more difficult, but they'll keep moving forward, and you can't coerce them by sanction. And I think that's a big part of what we're now faced with. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't know what Trump will do, but if he does get elected again, I would think he will probably reach out to Kim Jong-un, and I would think within, probably 9 months, they would have a meeting at some mutually acceptable place. I mean, I thought it was symbolically important when he stepped across the 39th parallel, and for the very first time, an American president was technically in North Korea. Kim Jong-un thought it was important. And it wasn't abandoning our commitment to South Korea, but it was an effort to start opening up North Korea so it wasn't a mortal everyday threat. And I think your analysis is exactly right. They're doing all of this posturing right now, tearing down bridges, destroying roads to the south. This is all posturing designed to say, it's almost like a temper tantrum. It's designed to say, pay attention to us.
Yes.
And I think the current administration simply can't do it. They don't have the skills, they don't have the sophistication and the subtlety, they don't have the patience. Trump has all of those.
Oh, I like everything you've just said. And I'll go to Professor Mansourov, but let me just make one last comment. We've heard it on this broadcast. We've heard it often. Let's have a policy of during the Biden administration of containing and deterring North Korea. And that's the policy. It's not reaching out to them. It's not trying to resolve these issues. It's not trying to look to give North Korea a path to normalization of relations with the US, but while we continue to look at complete verifiable denuclearization, but to do that, but a view that we can contain and deter North Korea. Well, we certainly haven't contained them. No, they have this very close alliance with the Russian Federation, with China, that goes back to the 1961 Peace and Friendship Treaty, and now a similar treaty with the Russian Federation. But also, you put Iran into this equation, this axis of authoritarian states. So we haven't contained them and deter. Well, they're building more nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver these weapons. And we just saw the Hwasong 19. So I would say, if you're looking at a policy, if that was our policy approach, we failed.
I think that's exactly right.
Professor Mansourov.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. And again, Speaker Gingrich, what an amazing discussion we're having today. Now, let me make a couple of points and then ask a question. If you look at the value of North Korean limited contingent in the current Russian considerations, I'm not a general staff officer in Moscow, Russian military general staff, but I suspect that one of the added benefits or added values of that deployment would be the opportunity to train a potent combat force to confront a potential enemy in the East. And what I mean exactly is that Russian general military planners are always worried about the possibility of second front being opened in the Far East. And it goes back to the Crimean War, Russo-Japanese War, First World War, let alone Second World War. And so with all the efforts by the United States to create, to strengthen its military alliances in Asia, through the Quad mechanism, various other minilateral security arrangements. Of course, the concern is that it's not just the US-ROC alliance which will pose a danger to the Russian Far East, but it's Japan. if Japan is rearmed, if Japan is motivated enough after having joined all these sanctions regimes against Russia, it might actually decide that it also has sufficiently badly felt grievances that they will be spurred into action. And so, as you know, the Russian Eastern military district has been hollowed out due to its exposure to Ukrainian conflict. And Russia doesn't really have all those assets they would need, military assets, to cope with the Japanese military threat. And for that reason, if nothing else, they need a powerful North Korean force to be able to contain, to suck in the Japanese military potential, absorb it, contain it, deter it, defend against it. You know, it may sound outlandish, far-fetched if you look at it from an American perspective, but from a Russian military planning perspective, it's a real concern. And North Korean People's Army, you know, if especially they can learn in real battle, scale it up, pass that knowledge to the main kind of force of the People's Army, that can, in Russian calculations, make a difference. Remember, in Syria, Russia deployed only 1 brigade, 3,000 troops. I mean, that's the limit of the contingent there. And yet, over 80,000 Russian troops went through that Syrian experience in 5 years. The same with North Korea. So that's one comment, the value of North Korean troops as a force potentially against Japan. Secondly, I agree with you, domestic mobilization really causes a great deal of concern for the Kremlin, and the value of North Korean limited contingent in that sense, it's not to supplement Russian forces, but it's to incentivize people like Lukashenko, you know, the Belarusians, members of the Union State of Russia, Belarus, to be a little bit more forthcoming and to be a little bit more willing to commit Belarusian troops to the joint effort. But let me ask you a question. I mean, you referred to, you know, statements made by some South Korean leaders, by American leaders, that if Kim Jong-un starts a war, this will be the end of that. My worry is that, you know, after this North Korean military deployment to Russia, South Korea is sleepwalking into a trap in Ukraine, because they really convinced themselves in Seoul that they're, way too big and important, and they can really make a difference both in Ukraine and on the peninsula. But the reality is, that's what Russians believed when they said, if Kiev attacks, this will be the end of regime in Kiev, Zelensky's regime in Kiev. And yet, we know it's not the case. It's the 3rd year of this war. They lost almost a million men between the two belligerents, and there is no end in sight. So clearly Putin made a major strategic miscalculation when he thought that the Russians could take on Ukraine and easily end that regime, actually walk into Kiev with flowers, being greeted by as liberators. The reality proved to be very different. Why? Because Putin ignored, I would say, the factor of alliance. The Western alliance railing behind Ukraine, supplying it with armaments, you know, our military expertise and everything. So my worry is, when we say if Kim Jong-un attacks, this will be the end of his regime, we might be actually making the same mistake the Russians made with respect to Ukraine and their calculations there, by ignoring the growing, really daily growing possibility, not only of the Chinese intervention, but also the Russian intervention now on legal, diplomatic, military, you know, moral grounds, if you wish. And if we have to confront in Korea, again, like 7 decades ago, not only Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un and his regime, but the Russians and the Chinese, it will be a very different equation. Like you talked about the events leading up to the First World War, you know, these alliance commitments kind of shaping up to basically explode in a major great powers confrontation. So that's my worry. And I cannot really, I would say we have to remove that highly provocative statement from the table, that if they attack, this will be the end of this regime. It will mean the beginning of a war, a major war in the Far East, but it doesn't mean that it will mean the end of the regime. It'll be just the beginning of very big tragedy, of really catastrophe, which might end up as a catastrophe, but it will not mean that. Kim Jong-un knows it because he looks at Zelensky and how that guy survived. And so he draws conclusions. If he gets Russia and China behind him. We saw the destruction, physical destruction on that battlefield in Ukraine. What happened with the previously prosperous and fertile land. I'd like to hear your kind of comment on that, if you.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it was the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, who said that the Russians would be in Kyiv in 3 days. So there was a general belief that the Ukrainians would collapse. And I think Putin thought he was taking a gamble more like the Crimean occupation than the beginning of a big war. Second, I think probably where I disagree with you a little bit is we have to get inside the notion that starting a war would have a catastrophic effect on his regime. Because if it only means it's the beginning of a war, that's a reasonable gamble. But if he thinks that the full weight of the American system and the Japanese system, et cetera, probably the Taiwanese and probably the Australians, I mean, there'll be a lot of people coming to dance. And their goal has to be the destruction of the regime. And again, you get into all the challenges of September and October 1950 and the Chinese coming in. But the truth was they had destroyed the North Korean regime. It was only propped up by the Chinese. I find it very sobering, and I'd like to hear your reaction, but I find it very sobering that there have been joint Russian-Chinese naval maneuvers. I think that this kind of activity is a very serious problem, and one that we have to really pay attention to and recognize that we have adversaries. Our adversaries are practicing together, training together, and they have basically, there's an American-led alliance and a Chinese-Russian-led alliance, and they really are soberingly like World War I or World War II in the sense that there's not much common ground right now between the two. And I think if we have a really dramatic revival, economically, et cetera, that probably things would calm down. But as long as we stay at the decay level that we're at right now, our opponents have a legitimate reason to believe that collectively they can ultimately beat us. And I think that's very, very dangerous.
So we only have a few minutes left, Speaker Gingrich, and let me just ask one final question, if I may. You mentioned China and Russia, joint naval exercises. We've seen that with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We recently in Russia, they hosted the BRICS, and a number of countries are coming on. They're looking at the global South. So they're looking at alliances also, these axis of authoritarian states. They're looking at bringing more countries to their path and their form of governance and how they want to, if you will, in my view, displace the United States as a world leader and so forth. But China has always been there on the North Korean issue because they want stability in the region. And China is going through some, and you know this better than anyone, economic issues. They're looking at the demographics. They've got a lot. Xi Jinping has a lot on his plate, but also Xi Jinping has a special relationship, I think, with President Putin. I think that relationship is really much more so than when you look at Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, or certainly going back to Deng Xiaoping. So this relationship. So do you think, Speaker Gingrich, that China, as they did in the six-party talks, can play a more constructive role and bring North Korea, if you will, back to the table to stop this escalation and to talk about how we can come together. Yes, you're absolutely right. There's almost zero chance that North Korea is going to completely verifiably denuclearize, but that doesn't mean that can't be our objective down the road. It may be a fool's errand. Maybe that's never going to be accomplished, but we will seek it. But there's a path to that, and that path could lead to a more normal relationship with a country that's not escalating and that's not threatening our South Korean and Japanese allies. So do you think China can play a more constructive role in bringing North Korea back to negotiations and becoming more responsible?
Well, I think two parallel but very different things. I think, first of all, that the Chinese, having looked at what happened when East Germany collapsed and the sheer economic burden on the West, which was far bigger than anybody expected at the time, the Chinese, much like the South Koreans, do not want the North Korean regime to collapse because the wave of migration, the dislocation, they really want a stable North Korea. And I think that they would be my guess is their internal projections are very sobering about how much pressure would be brought to bear if North Korea collapsed. Second, I think, and it'll be interesting to see if Trump does win, Xi Jinping was, with Trump as president, moving towards accommodation because we're still dramatically bigger than they are. And in fact, they desperately need us as customers. Under Biden, he's moved much closer to a confrontational approach, including Taiwan. And I think that really shapes things. If he looks down the road and decides that China's best interest is to find an accommodation with the Americans rather than to try to occupy Taiwan and to try to build an East Asian alliance capable of defeating us, then you go down one road. If he thinks that we are decaying and that the Japanese in the end won't really rearm and that the Australians really won't come in, et cetera, then he may go a different route. And I think that right now, I think he's sort of covering his bets and is prepared to go in either direction. And in many ways, it's the Americans who have the net advantage. I mean, an American, Indian, Japanese, South Korean, Taiwanese, Philippines, potentially Vietnam, and certainly Australia. I mean, that's a pretty big coalition. And even China now is in deep economic trouble. It's going to get much worse. Their demographic problems are, because of the one-child policy, are going to become horrendous. The amount of debt their local governments have is both unsustainable and catastrophic. And I think at some point, and I'm not sure that Xi Jinping survives. Despite the surface appearances, I think in some ways he's more vulnerable than Putin to being replaced, because I think the collective leadership won't tolerate risk-taking, and they don't have the level of terror at the top that Putin has. I mean, Putin's really dangerous to oppose because he kills you. And the Chinese have collectively concluded that that's not a policy they're willing to accept internally.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. This is so much to unpack, but I think your insights are just so outstanding. We want to thank you for your great service to this country, to the world, peace in the world. And again, what a great dialogue today.
Well, let me just say, I find the Washington Times invaluable. I think it is the one conservative outpost in a liberal capital. And I'm always delighted to have a chance to share ideas and to talk with people. Conservative philosophy.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. Michael, over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you, Ambassador DeTrani, for great moderation and commentary. Dr. Mansourov, always, you're so excellent and insightful. And Mr. Speaker, we are very honored by your presence. We learned so much as a scholar and as a leader that is also really directly playing an important role in advising our nation's leaders. I'm very grateful for the Washington Times, which covers our program. every month, and also the Korea Times and the other media institutions in Korea are picking up more and more this wonderful program. It is spreading throughout the world. So we really want to thank you for your participation. Today's election day, we did endorse, the Washington Times did endorse Donald Trump for president. And we're proud to do that based on policy issues. We want to thank everyone here. We really are looking forward to next month's program, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Speaker Gingrich.